In the fall of 1944, as the golden leaves of Virginia Beach drifted silently onto the property where Edgar Cayce spent his final years, a recording was secretly made. Not by the conventional means of the time, but through a silent typewriter, operated by hands trembling not from fear, but from reverence for what was being revealed. Cayce's personal secretary, Gladys Davis, had been instructed by the psychic himself to document what would be his most intimate confession, not about the thousands of psychic readings he had performed throughout his life, but about something he had never dared to share publicly, the signs that the dead send when they need help from the living. For decades, this manuscript remained hidden in the personal archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, marked with a red stamp that simply read "not for publication." Only now, 80 years later, as the world has finally begun to accept truths once considered heretical, has this document come to light. The following words have been transcribed directly from those time-yellowed pages, where the blue ink still holds the urgency of a revelation that could wait no longer. Edgar Cayce knew he was dying. He didn't need his psychic abilities to realize this. His frail body, which for so many years had served as a conduit between the visible and invisible worlds, was finally beginning to yield under the weight of decades of spiritual service. It was January 1945, and the blizzards that ravaged the East Coast seemed to echo the inner storm that consumed him. There was something that needed to be said, a truth he had carried with him since childhood, when he was just a quiet boy in Kentucky, able to fall asleep on books and wake up knowing their contents. On that cold afternoon, wrapped in a wool blanket his wife Gertrude had knitted years earlier, Cayce began to speak to Gladys about something that transcended all his previous readings. His voice, normally calm and measured, carried a different intensity, as if each word were wrenched from a deep and sacred place in his soul. He spoke of the dead, not as distant entities floating in ethereal planes, but as living consciousnesses maintaining invisible connections with those they left behind. The first revelation Cayce shared that afternoon was about the nature of post-mortem communication. Contrary to what many believed, the deceased didn't always find immediate peace after transition. Some remained in states of confusion, trapped by emotional patterns or traumas they carried from earthly life. Others found themselves in intermediate planes, not completely detached from physical reality, but also not fully integrated into higher realms, and it was precisely these spirits who most needed the help of the living. Cayce described how, during his own near-death experiences in childhood, episodes his family never understood correctly, he had encountered these lost souls. They wandered in hazy landscapes that seemed a blend of earthly memories and dreamlike realities. Some still wore the clothes they had on at the time of death, others appeared as if they were faded photographs of themselves. All, however, shared a common characteristic, a look of supplication, a desperate need to be seen, heard, understood. The psychic then revealed the signs by which the living could recognize when a deceased loved one was in spiritual distress. The first and most common was the sudden feeling of weight or oppression that overwhelmed surviving family members, especially during the first few weeks after the death. This wasn't natural grief, but something more specific, a physical sensation that something wasn't right, as if the air around them became denser, harder to breathe. Cayce explained that this happened because the newly discarnate soul, still strongly attached to the vibrational patterns of earthly life, desperately tried to communicate its state of confusion or need. It was as if it transmitted its own feeling of spiritual suffocation to those with whom it had the deepest emotional bonds. Sensitive family members often reported waking in the middle of the night with an inexplicable feeling of anxiety, or sensing an invisible but tangible presence during moments of greatest quiet. The second sign, according to Cayce's revelation, manifested through recurring dreams of a specific nature. These weren't comforting dreams where the deceased appeared at peace, smiling and conveying tranquility. They were disturbing dreams where the dead person seemed lost, confused, or repeatedly tried to communicate something urgent that the living couldn't understand. In these dreams, the deceased frequently appeared in places that represented transition, empty train stations, endless corridors, roads lost in the fog. Cayce recounted how, in his altered states of consciousness, he had witnessed these souls trying to penetrate the dreams of their loved ones. They approached the sleeping mind like butterflies drawn to light, but often couldn't formulate clear messages due to their own disorientation. The result was these fragmented dream images, laden with emotion but devoid of communicative clarity. The third sign revealed by the psychic related to inexplicable physical phenomena in the environment where the person had lived. Cayce described how souls in distress, still bound to material frequencies, could subtly but perceptibly influence physical objects. Lights flickering without apparent reason, electronic devices malfunctioning only in certain rooms, photographs falling from walls without identifiable cause. These were all signs that a discarnate consciousness was trying to draw attention to its situation. Even more significant, according to Cayce, was when the deceased's personal belongings began to appear in places where they shouldn't be. A wedding ring found on the kitchen table, a favorite book open to a specific page, clothes exuding an impossible perfume. These manifestations weren't attempts to haunt the living, but desperate pleas for recognition and help. The 7 signs. A spiritual medium's revelation in Sans Room Evening, as the afternoon fades and long shadows stretch across the room where Edgar conducts his readings, his voice takes on a deeper, more reverent tone. He begins to describe the 4th sign, perhaps the most subtle, yet the most significant. It concerns changes in the behavior of the deceased person's pets. Dogs and cats, possessing a natural sensitivity to spiritual presences, often exhibit agitation or inexplicable behaviors when a disincarnate soul is in distress. Edgar recounts instances where dogs spend hours staring intently at empty chairs where their deceased owners used to sit, but not with the nostalgic tranquility one might expect. Instead, they show signs of anxiety, whimpering softly, pacing in circles, or refusing to enter certain rooms. Cats in turn frequently position themselves as if watching something invisible move through the house, their fur bristling and pupils dilated, indicating the presence of energies imperceptible to humans. At this point in the revelation, Edgar pauses, his blue eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the window, as if seeing something that transcends physical reality. When he speaks again, his voice carries a different quality, almost hypnotic, as if the words come from a source deeper than his ordinary consciousness. He begins to describe the 5th sign, impossible synchronicities that begin to surround the deceased's family. These are not the comforting coincidences many interpret as signs from heaven, but unsettling events that seem to force the living to confront unresolved issues related to the departed. Numbers appearing repeatedly in impossible places, chance encounters with people who deliver specific messages about the deceased, shared dreams among family members who have never discussed the deceased. Edgar explains that these synchronicities are desperate attempts by the struggling soul to orchestrate events on the physical plane to draw attention to its situation. It's as if the soul uses all its residual energy to manipulate probabilities, creating coincidences that are not accidental, but cries for help coded in the language of the universe. During this part of his revelation, the medium does something unusual. He asks Gladys to stop writing for a moment and simply listen. He has sensed that many who will one day discover this document will be seeking not just information but genuine transformation in their lives. Therefore, Edgar suggests that those who truly wish to understand the mysteries he is revealing should seek out similar accounts, other revelations that might expand their understanding of the multidimensional nature of existence. He intuits that in the future there will be communication channels where these truths will be shared regularly, and encourages people to connect with these sources of spiritual knowledge to continue their journey of discovery. After this reflective pause, Edgar resumes his narrative with even greater intensity. He proceeds to describe the 6th sign, perhaps the most dramatic of all sudden changes in the physical or emotional health of the deceased's closest relatives. When a soul is truly in distress on the spiritual plane, its anguish manifests itself through the bodies and minds of those with whom it has the deepest bonds. Edgar reveals how he has witnessed cases where widows develop physical symptoms identical to those their husbands experienced before death, even when the medical causes are completely different. Children who have never suffered from anxiety suddenly find themselves plagued by inexplicable panic attacks. Siblings who have always been emotionally stable begin to have recurring nightmares or episodes of deep depression without apparent cause. These manifestations, according to Edgar, are not direct transfers of suffering, but reflections of the disincarnate soul's desperate attempt to communicate its needs through the only available channels, the bodies and minds of those it loves most. It is a primitive but effective form of communication, where the message is lost in translation between dimensions, resulting in physical symptoms that doctors rarely manage to adequately explain. The seventh sign revealed by Edgar relates to alterations in the family's collective dream environment. When a soul is in distress, not only does one person dream of it in a disturbing way, but multiple family members begin to have similar dream experiences around the same time. More significantly, these dreams often contain identical elements that no one has consciously shared, specific landscapes, symbolic objects, or fragmented messages that, when compared, form a coherent pattern of plea for help. Edgar describes how he has observed entire families being simultaneously visited by dreams where the deceased appears in situations of danger or confusion. In some cases, different people dream of different parts of the same narrative, as if the soul were trying to tell a complete story through multiple dream channels. When these fragments are brought together and analyzed as a whole, they always reveal the same fundamental message: the urgent need for spiritual assistance. As twilight approaches, and the room where Edgar conducts his readings fills with golden shadows, his voice takes on an almost prophetic quality. He proceeds to describe not only the signs that a soul needs help, but also the methods by which the living can offer that assistance. His words carry the urgency of someone who knows that time is running out, not only for him, but for many souls who remain lost between worlds. The first method of assistance revealed by Edgar is directed and specific prayer. These are not generic prayers for the deceased's peace, but targeted spiritual communications that explicitly acknowledge the soul's difficult situation. Edgar instructs that these prayers should be offered in states of deep inner quietude, preferably at times of day when the mind is most receptive, at dawn or dusk. The seer revealed that struggling souls were especially receptive to prayers that included forgiveness, both the forgiveness the deceased might be seeking and the forgiveness the living needed to offer. Often, Edgar explained, souls remain trapped in the in-between due to unresolved feelings of guilt, resentment, or incomplete emotional issues. Prayers specifically addressing these issues held the power to release these invisible bonds. The second method involved creating conscious and loving farewell rituals. Edgar described how many ancient cultures intuitively understood the importance of these rituals, but modern society had lost this wisdom. He revealed that family members could create simple yet powerful ceremonies at home, where they would speak directly to the deceased, expressing love, forgiveness, and encouragement for the soul to continue its evolutionary journey. These rituals, according to Edgar, were most effective when they included elements that had been significant to the deceased in life, their favorite music, flowers they cherished, or objects carrying positive memories. The important thing wasn't the complexity of the ceremony, but the sincerity of the intention and the clarity of the message: you are loved, you are forgiven, you are allowed to move on in peace. The third method Edgar revealed was perhaps the most surprising: the practice of conscious charity in the name of the deceased. The seer explained that struggling souls often carried the weight of actions or omissions they considered karmically unbalanced. When the living performed specific acts of kindness in the name of the deceased, especially acts the deceased themselves would have wished to perform, it created a form of energetic compensation that could help release the soul from its self-imposed burdens. Edgar recounted cases where families had managed to help lost souls simply through acts of generosity consciously performed in memory of the deceased. Donations to causes they supported, helping those in need using resources they had left behind, or simply acts of kindness performed with the explicit intention of honoring their memory. All these acts had the power to generate positive energy that reached the soul wherever it was. It was then that Edgar made his most extraordinary revelation. With a voice that seemed to come from oceanic depths of knowledge, he described a personal experience he had never shared with anyone, not even his wife. It was a vision he had had years before, during one of his deepest readings, when his consciousness was transported to an in-between realm where souls in transition awaited guidance. In this plane, Edgar had encountered a multitude of beings who seemed like ghosts of themselves, not haunted or terrifying, but simply lost and confused. They existed in a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and strange, like a city composed entirely of fragmented memories. Buildings materialized and dissolved based on the inhabitants' recollections, streets shifted direction following emotional patterns instead of geographical logic. What most impressed Edgar was realizing that these souls weren't trapped by external forces, but by their own beliefs and fears. Some couldn't accept that they had died, others feared the judgment they believed awaited them, while still others remained fixated on unresolved relationships or situations from earthly life. All, however, were bound by the same fundamental limitation, the inability to forgive themselves and move on. Edgar revealed that, in this vision, he had understood that the role of the living wasn't merely to mourn the dead, but to serve as bridges between worlds, offering disincarnate souls the unconditional love and forgiveness they couldn't give themselves. Each sincere prayer, each act of charity, each word of forgiveness spoken by earthly family members created waves of light that penetrated these in-between planes, offering lost souls the strength needed to free themselves from their self-created prisons. As his revelation approached its climax, Edgar described how he had learned to distinguish between souls that were genuinely struggling and those that simply maintained a loving presence near loved ones. Souls at peace, he explained, manifested themselves through comforting signs, sudden fragrances of flowers, sensations of warmth and protection, dreams where they appeared radiant and tranquil. Their presence brought comfort and never caused anxiety or disturbance. In contrast, struggling souls created atmospheres of unease, even when their intentions were loving. It was this fundamental difference in the energetic quality of the presence that allowed the living to discern when a deceased person needed assistance versus when they were simply offering love and protection. Edgar then revealed the eighth and final sign he had observed: the inexplicable intensification of family problems after the death of a loved one. When a soul remained trapped in the in-between due to unresolved issues, these issues tended to manifest in an amplified way in the lives of surviving family members. Old conflicts resurfaced with renewed intensity, family secrets came to light in dramatic ways, and dysfunctional patterns that had remained dormant suddenly became active. According to Edgar, this happened because the struggling soul, in its attempt to resolve its outstanding issues, unconsciously influenced the living to confront the same dynamics that it hadn't been able to resolve in life. It was a form of indirect communication, where the soul tried to use family members as extensions of itself to finish incomplete business. The seer explained that when families recognize these patterns and consciously work to resolve the underlying issues, not only among themselves but also in relation to the deceased, it often resulted in the liberation of the trapped soul. It was as if the earthly resolution of the conflicts created a resonance that reached the soul, wherever it was, offering it the peace it sought. When the clock on the wall struck 9 o'clock at night, Edgar paused, taking a long, deep breath. His hands, which had remained clasped across his chest throughout the revelation, slowly moved to cover his eyes. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock and the labored breathing of the seer. When he finally spoke again, his voice held a different quality, softer, more distant, as if coming from far away. He then revealed his deepest and most transformative experience. Years earlier, during a particularly intense reading, his consciousness had been swept beyond the intermediate planes he had previously described. He found himself in a realm of indescribable light, where souls who had completed their post-mortem healing journey resided in a state of perfect beatitude. In this realm, Edgar understood the fundamental truth about death and the continuity of consciousness. Physical death was merely a transition, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. Some butterflies emerged easily and flew immediately towards the light. Others struggled with the remnants of the chrysalis still clinging to them. The role of the living was to help these struggling souls fully free themselves, so they could take flight towards higher dimensions of existence. Most importantly, Edgar revealed that he had understood that all, absolutely all, human beings continued to exist after physical death. There was no annihilation, no void, no end. There was only continuous transformation, perpetual evolution, eternal love. Even souls who remained temporarily lost between worlds eventually found their way, aided by the love of the living or by spirit guides who never abandoned anyone. This revelation had completely changed Edgar's perspective on death. He no longer saw it as an end, but as a birth, not as a loss, but as a release, not as a cause for inconsolable grief, but as an opportunity for loving service. The living had the privilege of serving as spiritual midwives, helping newborn souls in the invisible world find their way home. As his revelation neared its end, Edgar turned his attention to the more practical aspect of his teachings. He provided specific instructions on how family members could create what he called circles of liberation, regular meetings where the family gathered with the specific purpose of sending love, forgiveness, and encouragement to their deceased loved one. These circles, Edgar explained, were most powerful when they included elements representing the four natural elements: a lit candle fire, a glass of pure water, fresh flowers or plants, earth and incense or perfume. The family should sit in a circle, holding hands, and each person should verbally express their feelings of love and forgiveness towards the deceased. More important than any specific ritual, however, was the sincere intention of helping the soul continue its evolutionary path. Edgar emphasized that possessive love, or the desire to keep the deceased close to the living, could, paradoxically, contribute to keeping them trapped in intermediate planes. Truly liberating love always encouraged the soul to move on, even if that meant a temporary distancing from earthly family members. Edgar revealed that he had learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. When his own son, Hugh Lin, had been gravely wounded in World War II, the seer had used all his psychic strength to try to keep him safe and close. Only later did he understand that this possessive energy, even motivated by the purest love, could interfere with the soul's evolutionary path if it had chosen to depart. Edgar's final revelation was about the cyclical nature of existence and the role of families as spiritual units that transcend a single incarnation. He explained that souls do not choose their earthly families randomly, but are drawn to specific groups of consciousnesses with whom they share karma, lessons, and common evolutionary purposes. When a family member made the transition of death, they did not permanently disconnect from the group, but assumed a different role, that of an invisible guide and protector. Their ability to effectively play this role, however, depended on their own spiritual evolution and release of unresolved earthly issues. Families who understood this dynamic and consciously worked to help their deceased members evolve spiritually created what Edgar called lineages of light, streams of evolving consciousness that extended across generations, both past and future. These lineages became powerful channels of healing, wisdom, and spiritual protection for all their members, embodied or not. When Edgar finally finished his revelation, dawn was breaking on the horizon. His last words were a direct appeal to the future readers of this document. He asked that they not see his revelations as dogma or doctrine, but as seeds of understanding that could germinate in their own hearts and experiences. Death, Edgar concluded, was not the end of the human story, but the beginning of an even more magnificent chapter. The living were not helpless victims of grief, but active collaborators in the cosmic evolution of souls. Every gesture of love, every word of forgiveness, every sincere prayer sent to a deceased loved one created waves of light that traveled through invisible dimensions, carrying the power of liberation and transformation. The most sacred role of human beings was not merely to live their own lives, but to serve as bridges between worlds, helping souls in all phases of their eternal journey. In this loving service, the living found not only a transcendent purpose, but also healing for their own pain and preparation for their own future transition. When his time came to depart, Edgar knew he would not be going into the unknown, but returning home, a home he had never truly left, only temporarily forgotten. And in that eternal home,
All the souls he had helped to liberate would be waiting, not to thank him, but to serve him in the same loving way he had served them during their earthly journey. Existence was an eternal circle of giving and receiving, loving and being loved, serving and being served. Death was merely a rotation in this sacred circle, not its interruption. And love, true, unconditional, liberating love, was the force that kept the circle in perpetual motion, across all dimensions, all lifetimes, all eternity. These were Edgar Cayce's final revelations on the signs indicating when our departed loved ones need our help, revelations that remained hidden for 80 years, awaiting the right moment to come to light, this moment when humanity is finally ready to understand that death is not an end, but a transformation, and that true love transcends all veils separating the worlds.